I'm here today to talk about China with Michael Sainsbury, a former China correspondent for the Australian newspaper. And we're here to get to the bottom of the propaganda wars. So give us a bit of history about you and China. They sent you there as a Chinese correspondent, and you went to Xinjiang, which is where the Uyghurs are, the subject, part of the topic we're going to discuss today, about the purported genocide of the Uyghur people.
Yeah, when I went to China, I was sent over because they wanted someone with a business background, which I did have, because the big story was Australia-China business and trade and how fantastic it all was. It was the golden years of Australia-China. We were fighting about iron ore, but we won that one. Rio Tinto didn't win so well, but BHP
and we even sold them the port of Darwin, of course, back in 2015.
Eventually, the person who signed the Australia-China free trade deal, Andrew Robb, sold them the port of China.
Well, things have changed a lot since then, haven't they?
They have changed a lot. The Murdoch press, or the mainstream press in Australia generally in those days, it was all go, pro-China. I mean, I'd struggle from Beijing to get a story about human rights, about indeed the Uyghurs, what had happened, what was happening even back then in Xinjiang. I was told that we needed to focus very much on the good news story of Australia. Iron ore and Australia's great friendship with China and how much money it would bring to Australia. Things have turned around a lot since then. Some people with a good sense of humour suggest it was after Wendy Deng and Rupert Murdoch's marriage was over.
Well, that's 2013, isn't it?
2013, and Rupert Star TV had not managed to get into China. Rupert said the Lowy Institute in 2013 we should have a constructive relationship with China. Boy, have they changed their tune.
Totally. I mean, we see this morning that on the home page, a second story on the home page of the website is, "We must ditch peacetime mindset." Peter Jennings, the head of ASPI, funded by weapons manufacturers and the government. So,
and the Japanese government, foreign governments funded.
Foreign governments as well.
Yes,
they're all there.
Our allies.
Yeah. It's a big money sink.
It is a big money sink.
Then
they look. I have to say they do have some very good people who work for them, and they do some good stuff. But their view on China is very much one-way traffic, and they have, from what I can see, I've been back in Australia for 2 years now. The Australian mainstream media is almost completely anti-China. You've got people like Peter Hartcher at the Fairfax Press. You've got the great Greg Sheridan, who's, I have to say, always been anti-China. But you've got Peter Jennings on the front page, a paid lobbyist for the military industrial complex.
Doing their op-ed for them on the front page. We would ditch peacetime.
Yeah.
Let's have a good old-fashioned war.
We've just got out of Afghanistan. We need another one, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because the Chinese will, because we botched that so badly, the Chinese will be taking that over now.
Taiwan is surely the next best bet for a good war.
So just to get to the nub of this, ASPI puts out a report claiming that there's genocide, or rather cultural genocide, of the Uyghur people, which are a Muslim minority in Xinjiang province.
Yeah, and look, I think this is, if we want to talk about let's just give us a bit of context. I mean, Xinjiang is the biggest province in China. It's up in the northwest. It was annexed by the Communist Party just after they came into power. Bits and pieces of it had been in Chinese hands for centuries, but never all of it. For a brief moment in the early 20th century, about half of the province was known as East Turkestan. It was briefly independent. The Uyghur people are a Turkic people. They're ethnically related to the Turks.
And they're Muslim.
And they're Muslim.
And it borders how many countries?
It borders India, well, in the shape of the disputed territory of Kashmir, where the Muslim majority. Pakistan, very small border with Afghanistan. There is Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and poor old Mongolia, which is trapped between China and Russia. So it borders mainly Muslim countries, including the Muslim part of India. And it is, from a security point of view, absolutely front and centre for the Chinese. You border that many. China has, it's 17 or 18 land borders with countries, but the problems are all up there. They don't have so many problems down in Southeast Asia because they've got communist states and client states and things like that.
So it's very complex geopolitically.
Very complex geopolitically. It's also a massive resources pool. It is 40% of China's coal reserves. It's got about a third of their oil and gas reserves.
Right.
Its huge deserts are now being used for massive solar and wind farms. So as a internal strategic resource, it's strategically important on that front as well. So it's very important for China to keep it safe, and they are rightly paranoid about Muslim fundamentalists coming in exactly the same way the West was worried about Muslim fundamentalists coming in after 9/11. In fact, we were so worried about it, we started 2 wars that went for 20 years. Yet we seem to have a problem with the Chinese doing their own security up in Xinjiang.
Well, so we're focusing on military threat too, and really the Chinese, with 1.3 billion people, their internal security is paramount before foreign affairs.
Yeah, and it's all a little bit linked up in that part of the world, because they see the potential threat coming from the Uyghurs, who do have connections to a lot of the people on the peripheries in Pakistan and Afghanistan, Talibans and groups like that. So they feel as though that external threat could become an internal threat, and that's where the tension is very much up there.
Okay, so we've commissioned Michael, who's a freelance journalist, to do a couple of stories for us on this very subject, because it's very hot. I mean, last year, myself and 4 other people were subject to a defamation threat over this whole issue to deal with the China spat. I mean, on one side, you got people saying, oh, he or she is a CCP, a Chinese Communist Party operative. They're funded by the Communist Party because they're so pro-China. There's a lot of loaded language going on either side. So we said to Michael, look, can you come in? You're a former China correspondent. You've been to Xinjiang. Can you come in and look at the claims of both parties? And on the one side, ASPI had Vicky Zhu to do this report about the genocide, or the cultural genocide of the Uyghur people. And then Jack James was published the other day in John Menadew's Pearls and Irritations, debunking the claims of Vicky Zhu and ASPI, saying there's no genocide. And so what we're going to do is get to the bottom of this right now. We know, there's no doubting that the Uyghur people are repressed. What did you find looking at the claims of both parties?
I think it's important to make that point at the beginning, that the gist of what the ASPI report is about is that the Uyghurs are being badly mistreated, that there are re-education camps, and the Chinese press openly talks about these re-education camps. The Chinese have been a part of their way, in their very ham-fisted authoritarian dictatorship kind of way of rubbing out the threat, is to try and assimilate them. I mean, you don't want to draw too many parallels, but in the same way as we tried to assimilate the Aboriginal people here in Australia a long time ago. That's what the Chinese people are doing. Chinese government's doing. They want them to learn Mandarin. They want them to. They don't want them to practice their religion so openly. Because they see the religion as the way the threat comes in. They would like them. They say, to become more rich and successful. Now the Chinese government, they want everyone to become more rich and successful. They're trying to make the country wealthier, and they see that as a way of, trying to.
Well, eradicating the threat of terrorism, because if they're poor and desperate, they'll be throwing bombs. Is that the idea?
Yes, it is a little bit, and they see their religion under threat. Again, we need the context in that the Chinese government doesn't like religion. They really see the Communist Party as the true religion of China. So they manage them, and they try and so-called sinicize them. They persecute Catholics, they persecute Christians, they throw priests in jail, they lock up bishops. So it's not just the Muslims. The Muslims, by and large, in China have been left alone a little bit more than the Christians, because the Christianity is growing at a much greater rate in China. So they see that as a different kind of threat. But again, it's not like the religious piece of this is anything that's not happening to other religions.
And so what sort of vibe did you get when you were there? What did you see when you were in Xinjiang?
I was there a long time ago. I was there in 2009. It was 5 months after the riots had broken out in Urumqi and Kashgar, which began this latest crackdown by the Communist Party on the Uyghurs. They've been There've been crackdowns in Tibet and Xinjiang ever since they annexed them, both in the 50s. But this latest one has been particularly fierce. They brought in a party secretary who'd been particularly successful in repressing the Tibetan people and using his so-called strike hard techniques in Xinjiang. None of their stuff is nice. And this is all straight from the Communist Party's Leninist playbook. They've done it to over the years. They've done it to homosexuals. They've done it to women. They've particularly done it egregiously under the one-child policy, where they had an entire multi-million-person department aimed at enforcing the one-child policy. There were forced abortions, very late term, some of them absolute tragic stories for decades and decades, mistreating their own Han majority nationals. So it's the tools and techniques the Communist Party is using against the Uyghurs. Nothing new in particular. And Jack James does make that point, is that she believes Aspie is trying to make it look as though they're getting some sort of special treatment, when really they're just getting a whole bunch of stuff from the Communist Party playbook. It doesn't mean it's good.
But it's being used, do you think, in Western propaganda circles to beat the drums of war? Is that the...
Look, there is absolutely no doubt that the people who want to build, who see China as a real military threat and are absolutely convinced we need to build up a capability and be ready to fight a war with them, will use anything they've got. And the Uyghurs, I think, have been used. I think they are being used for that. I mean, in a way, it's good that their plights come to light. But I think what the Western propagandists don't realise, maybe they do realise, is that the anti-China propaganda coming out of people like Aspie, not all the time, but some of the time, and think tanks in Washington, think tanks in Europe, looks awfully like the propaganda we see coming out of China.
Does it remind you at all? Because it reminds me slightly, and I'm very much on the sort of peacenik side. I can't see any point in going to war with China. I mean, maybe at some point they might make a move on Taiwan, but they're Han Chinese as well, so I don't think they'll be massacring each other. But the point is that obviously is a real possibility. And I had a bloke on the phone the other day, is very much on the warmonger side, wanting the Jack James piece taken down from Pearls and Irritations. That it was irresponsible, bad journalism, and I said no. And I asked him to defend his claim that it was erroneous, and he couldn't defend it, in fact. So there's a massive propaganda war going on. And I said, well, what would happen if the Chinese invaded Taiwan? Would you go to war? Should Australia go to war? Should we send our young men and women to war? He said, yeah, I'd be the first to jump in a uniform and go with it. I didn't believe that, of course.
Oh, no.
He's funded by the State Department, this bloke, but the point...
He'd be in the strategy room.
He'd be in the strategy room, that's right. He'd be on the conference calls. But, it's very hot, this whole thing. And one of Aspie's great problems is that they are funded by the weapons manufacturers. So every time they open their mouth on one of these issues, they open themselves up to claims of peddling weapons, because obviously if you can create the spectre of war, you can peddle weapons more easily for your donors.
That's right. And look, there's also the other piece of where the power shift has happened in Canberra over the last since the election of
from DFAT to
coalition.
Aspie.
So not so much from DFAT to Aspie, but it's the ascension of the Defence Department, of the Department of Home Affairs, and ASIO above DFAT, and that's something that the people I know in DFAT, I know a lot of them, have been gnashing their teeth about for a long time, is the diplomacy, by and large, which is what DFAT tries to do, has been pushed down the list to where you get Peter Dutton speaking on behalf of the Australian government about China, rather than Maurice Payne.
Well, they love an enemy, so it's natural for them to create an enemy in order to, a xenophobic threat.
And I think we should also be careful too to realise that the defence ministers don't necessarily always speak for the people in defence forces. Most people in the defence forces understand what it's like to have people near them killed or maimed, particularly.
And they're more interested in defence rather than attack.
Much more interested in defence rather than attack. You speak to a lot of soldiers and ex-soldiers and the sailors, and they say that the warmongers are the dangerous people.
Well, that's what David McBride, of course, the famous whistleblower, the Afghan war files, says. Afghanistan being a farce as well. But of course, we're not at war at the moment, having pulled out of there. And so now we have the spectre of an engagement with China, which people seem to be pushing. But to get to the Uyghur issue, is there genocide of the Uyghurs or not?
Well, I don't think. Look, I'm not prepared to judge that or not, because we can't actually know exactly what's going on inside. What's happening is dreadful. I think there is definitely, if cultural genocide is a term, the Han Chinese are very keen to rub out a lot of practices they see, for better or worse, as ones that might invite terrorism into the country.
Well, so some of the people pushing the Uyghur repression genocide argument.
I think there is no doubt that there is serious repression. There is no doubt.
So an internment and so on. So we get these aerial photographs, very redolent of 2001, when Colin Powell went to the UN to create the case to invade Iraq, saying, look, here we go, see that truck, that must be carrying biological weapons, and there's what looks like a chemical weapons factory there, these aerial photographs. And this is what's happening right at the moment. There's people on YouTube saying, look at that, from way up in the sky, that has to be a watchtower. And that looks like a fence.
I have to say, I've zoomed in on some of them, and I think they're probably.
They're correct.
Satellite technology's gotten pretty.
It's good.
Pretty good.
So they are interned in fences.
The Chinese government press has said that they are. And one of the big points that ASPI makes in its report is that they're upskilling them, and then they're sending them off to other parts of China to work in factories where they're very closely monitored.
So
now again, Jack James makes the point that there's nothing particularly new in this. I mean, economic migrants in China have been treated by a lot of companies on the East Coast, where all the factories are, quite badly. They're made to work long hours. You know, she spends a lot of time going through the minutiae of ILO work rules and things, all of which is very legitimate, because the ILO is an international organisation. But to try and to lock that in with what's happening in China seems to me a little bit specious. And I'm not sure China's a signatory to the ILO.
Yeah. So to get to the...
But from a technical point of view, I can see what she's trying to do is unpick a lot of their arguments and say you can't put your hand in your heart and say a lot of this stuff.
So her claim is essentially they've been too generalised and simplified, and they're not over the nuances.
Yeah, and that's exactly what they have tried to do, is to generify and simplify it. Yeah. And Jack James's 100-page report is very dry and tough going at times, because it's so detailed and because it's so legalistic. The ASPI report is very designed for swallowing up by a media that, as we know, Michael, is incredibly stretched these days because of what's happened, because of the internet and the money that's gone out of the media. So these things are designed to be picked up, basically copy and pasted and chucked in newspapers.
So to get to...
So that suits the propagandists of the arms dealers.
Yeah, so they can just lump this information out there with broad brush claims. So
it doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of truth in it.
So they're repressed, but genocide might be too strong a word.
Genocide could be too strong
Cultural
a word.
genocide's a new word, but it does have the word genocide in it.
Yes.
So it's misleading in that.
Genocide is bandied around so much these days, it's really starting to lose its power, I think, which is awful. It happens to words over time, doesn't it?
Okay, so get to Taiwan, which will be the pretext, which is, the idea is, do we go, if there's a move on, does Australia tag along with America to a war against China if China invades Taiwan? What is the chance of China invading Taiwan, and when might it happen, if there is a chance?
Look, there's always a chance of China invading Taiwan, because they're always talking about it. There's nowhere in the world where there are so many arms pointed as there are across the 90-mile Taiwan Strait. I mean, it's swimmable, the Taiwan Strait. It's not a very wide piece of water. Taiwan is quite a difficult place to invade in terms of its geography.
It's very mountainous, isn't it?
Yeah, well,
But
no,
they're
it's,
Han
it's,
Chinese. That's the
it's,
point, isn't it? So it'd be Chinese killing their. I mean, there'd still be family connections across the ditch.
there are huge family connections, huge
Yeah.
business connections,
Yeah.
and if you want to go back into the history of one of the interesting things about Taiwan is that Taiwan has never actually been part of China while the Communist parties run China. In fact, Taiwan has very rarely been part of China. It was a Portuguese colony, a Dutch colony, and for a long time it was under Japanese rule. It's the only part of China as such that actually likes Japan. You go to Taiwan, you go to Taipei, and there are loads of Japanese restaurants. The Japanese are there, they're good mates. And you've seen that in recent times where there's been a lot of support from the Japanese government for the Taiwanese. That, of course, would rile Beijing even more because the enmity between China and Japan goes back thousands and thousands of years.
So there's a small part of the public in Taiwan which would like to see reunification, but they're very much in the minority, aren't they? So there would have to be some force.
It's a shrinking minority, and you've seen that particularly back in 2000 and gosh, I'm trying to get my years right now. I think it was 2009, 2010. The Kuomintang, which had been ruling Taiwan by as a dictatorship under Chiang Kai-shek and then his son for a long time, and then morphed themselves unbelievably successfully into a democracy to the point where we've now had 4 or 5 peaceful changes of power and different parties in power. We've got the Democrats in power, which are the pro-independence party. The Kuomintang has been badly defeated at the last 2 elections. They're the party that favoured closer ties with China. There were people in that party who wanted to reunify. As a new generation has grown up, very much the majority of opinion in Taiwan is they don't want to reunify with China. Why would they?
Well, so what's the expert opinion now? The non-lobby group expert opinion, academics and so on, versus your opinion on when or if China will move or how they might do it?
I think you pick 10 academics, get 10 different answers at the moment.
And America, of course.
America's, and again, there's it's a very grey thing whether America does come in and support
actually
them.
move. Yeah.
America has been selling them arms. Every time America sends them arms, China starts buzzing their planes over. There's always the problem in China with the economy in China at the moment is under a great deal of stress. They're about to have their first real wave of COVID. It's going to bring incredible tension inside the country.
The Omicron.
That internal security piece. As the internal security piece gets tighter, they use external security and nationalism as a distraction. And I think that's the thing that people fear the most.
It doesn't happen anywhere. It wouldn't happen in Australia using these kind of distractions.
No, or the US.
Or the US, of course.
Go and invade Afghanistan.
No, that's right.
No.
That's right.
George W.
So we saw last year the ABC's Q&A program deal with the China issue, and it was stacked with people from the lobby group, from ASPI, or people associated with it. Stan Grant, who was the host himself, is a fellow, or has been a fellow of ASPI. They get their voice heard in the mainstream media. So we are going to hear a lot more about this propaganda war. There's a lot of money at stake. Defence is the biggest item of expenditure. It's like hockey stick growth in the past 8 years of coalition government. I mean, the billions expended on defence, there's a lot of money riding on this.
Well, in fact, defence is so important, Michael, that in the middle of an Omicron wave where people in Australia are dying, we've decided to buy $3.5 billion worth of tanks.
Yeah, we looked at the tanks. We paid 40% too much for them, of course.
Of course.
The cover price was much less, and we've overpaid as we usually do. But what a useful...
No doubt the people selling us the tanks are probably funding ASPI.
Well, no doubt they are, but what a useful piece of military machinery it is, tanks. If we do go to war, we can put the tanks on
the nuclear submarine.
On a submarine and take them to Formosa.
We won't be able to put the submarines under the water, but those can sit on the top.
We'll get them there somehow. Give us your rundown on the media coverage, the propaganda wars, and how it's seeping into...
It's quite interesting, Michael. I mean, I lived, as you know, out of Australia for nearly 12 years in China, and then in Southeast Asia, where I'd actually spent a lot of time writing about the relationship that Southeast Asian countries have with China and China's increasing influence in that region. which is something I think the Australians should be a bit more focused on than what's happening inside China. We can't do anything about what's happening inside China. And I will make this one point before I get back to that, is that what people like Aspie perhaps don't realise is, or they may realise it, they should realise it, they're smart enough, when they put a report like this out, the Chinese government sees it as internal interference, and they realise, they look at who's funny, they know it's the Australian government, they know it's the arms deals, they know it's the State Department. And so that actually can do, and Jack James makes this point in her paper, that we may be doing them more harm than good. By bringing that out, the Chinese government may crack down harder on them just to show us what they can do. That's the mindset we're dealing with. So maybe it's not so smart to use people using anyone inside China to attack the Communist Party doesn't do them any good. But we're not getting that sort of nuance in the Australian media, because when I came back here 2 years ago, fleeing from the plague and then fleeing from the military coup in Myanmar, it's kind of remarkable when you see it up close how unnuanced the China story now is in the Australian media. It's become very black and white. We talked about it earlier. Some of the lead commentators who get on the front page are almost all exclusively very anti-China. Or anti-Chinese Communist Party, and we have to make sure we're drawing those distinctions as well. The Chinese people are fantastic. I mean, I lived there for 4 years, love it. Much preferred the Chinese to the Thais. Sorry to all my Thai friends. But the Chinese Communist Party, a particularly nasty group of people, as all authoritarian governments are. As governments become more authoritarian, they get nastier. Look at our own. But we're not seeing any of this in the Australian media. We're not seeing the nuance. We're not getting from Aspie. We haven't got the context. For instance, just on this particular report, we haven't got the context of the why. We've got the what's happened, but without looking at the causes, how can we really understand why the effects are what they are?
So there'll be more goodies and baddies. It's going to go on and on. It's unlikely that a war will happen, but there'll be propaganda will be unrelenting. So
every nasty thing that the Communist Party do, and they will continue to do them when they lock up Australian writers and newsreaders. That's a very legitimate thing for us to get very upset about. But those people will still be, held up and used by the propagandists here, and nothing's going to help them, frankly. But it's a lose-lose situation in a lot of ways. So the Australian public's losing because we're not really getting the full story.
No, well, there's no nuance. So we lock people up here, of course, too. We've still got the people who've been there up to 9 years on Nauru.
Well, no, Novak got to see some of them recently.
Novak got to meet some of them. So, we're not unblemished in this country.
No, we're not. And it's of course we're not. And
we don't hear any of this from the pulpit at Aspie, though, do we? We don't hear any of this.
They would say that's not their job.
And meanwhile, we're $5 billion worth of arms trade to the Saudis to repress Yemen, which I always look at as going, well, why do they never talk about that? They don't talk about it because they need to focus on creating one enemy, in my view. But as you say, it should be more nuanced. Now,
the other great danger that this anti-Chinese xenophobia, some of it is, anti-Chinese propaganda is, there are over 2 million people of Chinese heritage in Australia, and it can't possibly be good for them to have people looking at them suspiciously.
Cooking up xenophobic narratives.
Cooking. Australia's racist enough as it is. We don't need any help.
Thanks for coming, Michael. It's been great to have a chat. We were looking for somebody to cut it straight down the middle. The actual, the real human view.
That's what journalists are supposed to do, Michael.
Supposed to. Unfortunately, they don't do it all the time, and I think we've achieved that. You can read the story, Michael's stories, on the website as we roll them out. And thanks for watching.
Let's see how quickly I get cancelled.
That's right. It's good to be cancelled. I've been cancelled long ago. It's been very, very good for me to be cancelled, having had been cancelled. So, thanks for coming, mate.
Thanks very much for having me. It's been great fun. Let's do it again.
We will.
Yeah.